Hello guys, welcome to the lecture on Chapter 6, Section 2. Today we're going to summarize the developing foreign policy with France, Great Britain, and Spain in George Washington, and then into John Adams' presidency. We're going to explain how the United States dealt with Native Americans and British interest in the West, which is really important because this will eventually lead to another war with Britain in just about 15-20 years. And then we're going to identify some of the deep divisions between the Federalists and Republicans, which will become the first two political parties in United States history.
Those divisions we'll see are going to start in that sectionalism versus nationalism debate, which is basically going to be the entire debate where everything hinges on, all the way up to the Civil War.
Right.
So this is very important for that.
So, the response to the French Revolution for early Americans began this divide. Following the American Revolution, and we know all about Marquis de Lafayette, well, he traveled back to France, and as you know from world history last year, the French then had their own revolution. Now, many Republicans, small government people like Thomas Jefferson, who loved the revolutionary spirit, believed in states' rights, wanted George Washington and the American government, the government of the United States, to support the French. They felt like the French supported us in our revolution. It's only right that we support them in theirs. But Washington, mostly due to the advice of his good friend Alexander Hamilton, decided it's a little selfish, but it's best for the United States in this very early stage of development to stay neutral in the French Revolution and take care of their business at home as opposed to spreading themselves too thin abroad.
Okay, Pinckney's Treaty is a treaty we make with Florida, right? Again, Florida controls the land west of the Mississippi River, right? And they also control Florida, parts of Alabama, parts of Mississippi. A lot of that land disputed. This is one of the first treaties we make with Florida, with the Spanish, and kind of it opens up trade along the Mississippi River, which again, for those western farmers, those farmers moving into the Northwest area, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Mississippi River is very important for their economic livelihood. Right? And the Spanish, who had control over it, it was important that we had a good relationship with them. This also gives us a lot of the land that is today Mississippi and Alabama, but I think we can give back. Right?
The Treaty of Grenville, so as you can see, we're talking about America's dealings internationally now. So what was the foreign policy early in American history? Pinckney's Treaty, huge win for the United States. This was an awesome treaty. Spain was afraid. Mr. Manelsky mentioned the details of it. Why did Spain give this up? Spain was actually afraid of an alliance between the United States of America and Britain. They were afraid of basically being totally overtaken in the New World, so they gave us a lot of concessions. One of the reasons they were afraid of an alliance between the U.S. and Britain is because of this third treaty down here, Jay's Treaty. Now, Jay's Treaty was a treaty made between the United States and Great Britain over navigation rights and British forts in the Northwest. Now, prior to John Jay going to Britain, though, Alexander Hamilton had actually communicated with Britain that we're going to give you our demands, but we'll actually concede quite a few of them. Alexander Hamilton was a huge fan of Britain. He was what you can call an Anglophile. So when John Jay went to Britain, they held firm in their demands. John Jay came back with a really bad treaty. All of these ships that the British had taken from us, they refused to pay back. All of the money they owed us, they refused to pay back. And it made America look weak. But to the French, it made it look like the United States of America is having a quasi-alliance with Britain. Because when the French agreed to join us in the Revolution, in 1778, we signed a treaty with them, saying we would never sign a treaty with any of their rivals. Well, to them, this looked like a violation of that treaty. And that's very important, because the French would be very angry at us moving forward. To wrap up our international dealings, the Treaty of Grenville gave us present-day Ohio. It was a treaty with the Native Americans, in which was a favorable one to us. And so now we can keep moving forward and expanding into this western area.
Okay, so we have the first presidential election after Washington, right? So Washington serves for 2 terms and decides to not run again. Again, not until after FDR's presidency are presidents constitutionally limited to only 2 terms. And so Washington decided not to run. He set the precedent, and pretty much every other precedent followed after him. Okay? He warns famously in his farewell address for Americans not to get into entangling alliances, not to try to involve themselves too much into the affairs of Europe. Right? And at that time, we were starting to move in there, but because we were trying to get more control over our land, right? Not necessarily in the affairs of Europe. And he also warns not to end up in political parties, try to keep elect the best man for the job, not who your party is, but that did not work out very well for Washington. You have 2 general political parties are formed. The Federalists, right? That's Hamilton. Most of them are going to be the bigger government, right? A stronger national government, stronger national banks, systems, government, right? And then there's also the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson and many others who are going to be similar to the Anti-Federalists, the farmers, the the party of the people, right? The lower classes, the working classes, the small farmers, suspicious of the banks and the traders and the merchants.
So what you have here, as Washington leaves the presidency, like Mr. Manelsky mentioned, he gave his farewell address warning against foreign entanglement and political parties. One thing that's interesting is it's clear to Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and all the other people you would deem Federalists that a competing political faction is emerging in the United States, led by, like Mr. Manelsky mentioned, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Samuel Adams, and others. Now, one interesting thing about Washington's farewell address is it wasn't written by Washington. Once again, that diminutive, power-hungry Federalist, Alexander Hamilton, inserts himself into politics again. He wrote the farewell address, and he had Washington deliver it. And the reason why he said no political parties is he knew the Republican Party would threaten the Federalist power. And Hamilton did not want that to happen. And so he had Washington deliver his message.
Yeah, Washington didn't have a political party, but he was essentially a Federalist.
Yeah,
his
actions would tell us he would be, and he agreed with a lot of the Federalist framework on government. So in the election of 1796, John Adams wins, Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president. And you might be thinking, well, that's weird. One's a Federalist, one's a Republican. Why are they working together? And that's because of the laws of the time. Before, and we're not going to go into great detail, but election laws were a bit different. The man who wins is president, the man who comes in second is vice president. Today we have a totally different system following the next election.
Which falls in line with the party system, right? When they wrote the Constitution, they didn't necessarily plan on the political parties emerging the way they did, so they looked at it as a way that the 2 most popular people in the country would be the leaders, but in the reality of political parties, didn't quite work out.
And really, the country is beginning to come apart at this point. The political parties are going to be clearly formed throughout Adams' presidency. And what's really important to talk about is how Adams' presidency actually helped lead further to the division between Federalists and Republicans.
Right. First is the XYZ affair. This was a couple of basically French diplomats were trying to buy influence and get American bribes from American diplomats for access to the French court and to help sign some treaties. When this became public news, the 3 men were X, Y, and Z in the leaked document. It became, very, people in America were very upset about it because that they were seeing it as the French were not respecting the Americans. They were seeing it as the French acted like they were so elitist, so much better than the Americans, that we'd have to pay just so we could talk to them. Right? Not very happy. And this led to almost a quasi-war, naval war with France.
And this is really important because the French are still bitter with our quasi-alliance with Britain through Jay's Treaty. The French also loved Washington. They did not like Adams. They did not like Federalist ideals. They knew the Republicans had their interests more at heart. So this leads to even more tensions with France. Additionally, at this time, John Adams sees that there are 2 parties forming, and there's a lot of immigration to this new country with all these freedoms and natural rights. These immigrants are siding with the Republicans, and John Adams and the Federalists want nothing to do with more Republican voters in the country. So he passes the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, saying if you move to America, you have to wait 14 years to vote in an election. This basically quiets any type of immigrant influence on the vote, helping the Federalists. He also says you can't speak out against the government. That's sedition. You can be arrested for speaking out against the government. Here's the huge issue, is that speaking out against the government is in the First Amendment. You are given that right in the Constitution to do that. This is a blatant violation of constitutional laws. So, to counteract that, Jefferson and Madison, the two most famous Republicans, wrote the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. And they portended that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government. The states, Virginia and Kentucky, agreed to be part of the United States under the Constitution if the federal government acted within the bounds of the Constitution. This is not. This is a violation of the First Amendment. Therefore, they were arguing we do not have to follow it. And they started this idea of a state being able to consider the constitutionality of a law. In 1803, the Supreme Court will have that power, and it will be a moot point. But at this point, before Marbury Madison, they don't.
And we'll see all the way up into the Civil War, even past the Civil War, states trying to not follow federal law.
Yeah,
and in
called
our federal
nullification.
system, we have the federal government, the powers of the federal government oversee those of the states, right? But a lot of states, especially when it comes to the issue of slavery, are going to try to push back against the federal laws in the case. Okay? Thank you for watching, guys. We'll be right. The 6.3 will be up soon. Hope you have a good time. Good day.